Reading nonfiction like a detective is a unit that we've got at 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. In 8th grade, it's slightly different. It's reading like a cognitive linguist, but that's a separate conversation there. Reading nonfiction like a detective, as you can see from the introduction to the unit, is built around this idea that we can think about different ways of reading with our students. We can talk about reading as sometimes being something we approach on the surface. We can read on the surface of a text, and we can also aim to read below the surface, where we're looking for more of what's going on in a text. So this metaphor of on the surface and below the surface of a text is going to carry throughout the unit. And the unit opens with this focused approach to helping students think about what it means to read like a detective. I'll unpack more of that in a moment. But just to give you a general overview of the structure of the unit, it begins with students reading a story called The Landlady by Roald Dahl, which is an interesting and delightfully strange little story. It's engaging and weird in all the ways that sixth graders often respond well to. And we use that story, The Landlady, to start thinking about the kinds of moves somebody makes. It's not exactly a detective story, but the character is making these observations. He's kind of seeing clues about things. He starts kind of putting together some of the ideas in his head as things are going on around him. And we use that as a jumping off point to say, what are some of the moves we see this character making? What are some of the moves we make as we read this story? And how are we putting together ideas about it? And how can we think about reading like a detective with those same moves? You know, if we have a character who's making observations, what does it mean for us to make observations as we read? If we have a character who's starting to connect the dots between things or make inferences, what would that look like for us to read like a detective in those ways? So the opening story is The Landlady, and it's especially there for that purpose, to help us think about what it means to read like a detective. And then students move into a bit of work with some advertisements. You'll need to select some advertisements in advance for this work, and I'll talk through that in a moment as well. That's the first little project that students do, is they get to examine those advertisements, think about them and the on the surface message, as well as the below the surface messages of those ads. And then we move into the first of two nonfiction texts. The first one, by Jonathan Kozol, follows a young boy around in a neighborhood in New York. He's walking around with this child as this child kind of explains the neighborhood to him and the things that they've gone through, the stories he's heard about it. He's walking through different locations and pointing things out. And once again, we can look at this text on the surface and say literally what's going on in it. But there's also a lot to be said as we think about what's going on below the surface in it as we read like a detective, to see what's the subtext here. Once students have worked through the text by Jonathan Kozol, they're going to then read a text by Eric Schlosser, and that is from his work McJobs. And this selection is really about all of the different ways that a fast food company moving into a typical suburb affects that town over time. So it's addressing the town, the growth of the town, the changes in it, the people, and especially the teenagers who are employed by that corporation. There's a lot going on in that text. And so once again, we have an opportunity to read it on the surface and below the surface. We think about reading like a detective, and how does that help us uncover what's going on in here? In that final assignment in the very last session, students are going to take either of the two papers they've written and revise it and resubmit it, incorporating what they've learned about reading like a detective and writing about these topics. So I like to point out that as you are planning, it's often good to kind of skim through the at-a-glance section in the books. These can give you a feel for the agenda of each session and the general guiding questions that you'll see going through each session. And then as we go down to the opening session of the unit, we jump right into The Landlady, like I was saying. In this session, we read the text with students, and they are specifically thinking about this idea of reading like a detective. And so we introduce that idea, we introduce the text, we're not focusing on a major interpretation of this text. So don't feel like over this session and the next one, you have to dig really deep into this text, The Landlady. Really what we're doing is we're thinking about what's going on in the story and what kinds of detective moves are we seeing that can help us think about this question. Because in the second session, we're going to work on building this theory of what it means to read like a detective. So we're not going to especially tell students what it means to read like a detective. We're going to invite them to think about it and to build that idea with us. So they're given the task to think about what it means to read like a detective, to think about what the character Billy Weaver is doing in the text. Does he make any detective-like moves that we can point to? And then we're going to build a chart together as a class and think about, okay, what are things that this character does, that we do as readers during this text, that can give us an idea of what it means to read like a detective. And we build this chart. When we read like a detective, we, for example, notice things that seem strange. We're looking at details. We're making connections between them. Session 3 moves immediately on from the landlady. So like I said, you don't need to spend a ton of time digging really deeply into the landlady because it's a jumping off point. We're building our theory about reading like a detective from that, and then we're moving forward. And the first opportunity students get to practice this idea of reading like a detective is through a set of advertisements. Now, you will need to select some of these in advance. So you'll want to find about 3 or 4 advertisements, maybe 4 or 5, even just kind of give yourself a few more to work with. When you're selecting these ads, you're going to want to choose them thinking about the question, what are these ads saying about what boys and girls are like? Now, that's a pretty broad question. That's a big question. There's a lot of implications in that. And it's not the goal of all of this to go into the full depth of that question, but it's because advertising often contains implicit messages about these things, and that makes it a good opportunity to practice this kind of thinking. So in the reading ads like a detective work, students are going to get the chance to think about a set of ads on the surface and literally describe what's happening in it, and then also consider what's going on below this surface. What is this ad implying? What are the messages that are not necessarily stated out right here, but are conveyed through the structure of, or the language of the advertisement. And in this session, you get the chance to model some of that thinking with students. You introduce the idea of reading advertisements like a detective. You might talk through a little bit of the reading on the surface. And in this first one, that's what they're focused on. They read on the surface for the ads that you give them. And then in the following session, they start thinking about what's going on below the surface. And in this section, I have to say that I really like the kinds of questions that we're asking here that are very critical questions. We want our students to be able to think about these things at this age and as they get older. These questions here are, what assumptions does this ad make about its audience and that audience's values? What kind of person would probably be receptive to this ad's message? What kind of person might be resistant to it? Those are really, really great questions for students to be wrestling with, and they work really well with this unit in reading like a detective. That's the kind of critical reading we are hoping to see from students. The reading ads like a detective work continues on for a couple sessions. There's some discussion and writing work associated with that. And we step back and think about it, get a chance to reflect before moving into the Jonathan Kozol text. So as I mentioned, this text has Jonathan Kozol walking around a neighborhood guided by a young boy named Cliffy from that neighborhood. And there's a lot going on. So once again, on the surface, you could read it as just this is him walking around a neighborhood and he's learning some interesting things from this boy. But also, there are a lot of implications in this text. There's a lot of subtext that really constitutes an argument. And Kozol, in this chapter that's selected for this, he's not necessarily making that argument outright. He's letting the reader kind of take in these details and sort of perceive what he's saying. So you have to read below the surface to really consider what's going on in that. And we get a few sessions to consider that with students. In session 8, this becomes an argument paper, a 2 to 3 page argument in response to the question, what are the most significant below the surface messages that Kozol creates in his text? That's a pretty significant assignment in terms of the length and the complexity of that. So one thing I will say is, if students have been going through each of the previous units, they will have written a number of papers by this point. They will have written a couple different arguments along the way, some informational explanatory writing. We hope to see their writing growing across the course of the year. And these don't need to be 2 to 3 perfect pages. Don't necessarily feel like you have to push students to go through multiple drafts and get this to a highly refined place, because once again, the final task in this unit is that students choose one of their papers to go back into and revise further. So it's okay if they have a 2 to 3 page decent draft of a response to this. Remember that they can draw on all of the classroom discussions, the charts that they've been building, the notes from their conversations in small groups, and anything else that's come up in the classroom. So we want to make sure that students are well prepared with ideas, with content to talk about for this. As I described earlier, Eric Schlosser is the second text, and we get to work through McJobs with students, and that follows a very similar process. So we read a little bit about Eric Schlosser and who he is. We read the text together with students. We think through it and do some comprehension work. And the comprehension work here involves chunking the text, breaking it down, summarizing each of those smaller chunks so that we can essentially read on the surface. We can kind of put together the basic gist of what's going on in this text. And once we've got that, that allows us to dig a little deeper. We can read Schlosser's work like a detective and think, what's going on beneath the surface of this text? And so just like we were reading for the messages in Kozol's text, students are going to write another paper about the underlying messages about life in Martinsburg that Schlosser seems to be hinting at or moving us toward as readers. As students move into the writing work for that task in session 14, I encourage you to think back to the papers that they had just written for the Kozol text so that you can think about what kinds of feedback you were giving to them. What are some things that you might want to give them a heads up about? And you can also ask them to reflect on it. You know, in my last paper, one thing that I did well was this, and something that I'm going to work on as a goal for this paper is this. Or you can talk to them about what were the difficult parts they had with the previous paper. What were the challenges they ran into? Can we brainstorm some solutions to that as we go into this writing? It's also worth pointing out that in this second cycle of work in this unit with Eric Schlosser's text, students write and then come back to a whole class discussion. And that is a switch from what you would have commonly seen earlier in this unit and in other units where students have the discussion before writing about it. A lot of times we want to have that whole class discussion first so that students can move into the writing work and have a lot to draw on, like I was saying a moment ago. And sometimes we also challenge students to write first, to get all of that thinking down that they can, and then they can bring that to the discussion. Now, as I've said a couple times, students can revise either one of these papers for their final work, so it's okay if the paper that they just wrote for Schlosser isn't perfect. It's okay if they have this whole class discussion and have new ideas or want to make changes to what they said. That's great. But you'll notice that, there's a slightly different character to the discussion if it happens before students have written, where they're kind of testing out their ideas and moving kind of tentatively toward their thinking, or a conversation or discussion that happens after they've written, where they've really formulated those, they've worked on putting those ideas together and connecting the dots between their evidence maybe a little bit more. And so the discussion can look a little different, sound a little different as a result. Neither is necessarily better, they just are different, and they're in different places for different purposes. So they have a whole class discussion, and it closes with a chance to step back, think about the unit and the work they've done, think about what they've learned about reading like a detective and why that might be a useful thing to do. And then, like I said, they get to revise one of their papers and write a brief commentary about their learning for the unit. I always want to emphasize that these moments for reflection and metacognition are extremely important. These little tasks that might come up at the end of a unit or sometimes at the end of a session where we have students reflect back on what they've learned or how they did something and to think about how they might use it again in the future. That's where we aim to kind of help cement the learning, help them step back and see, okay, we weren't just working with these two texts. I didn't only learn about Kozol and Schlosser. I actually also was learning how to read for details, how to think about texts in a certain kind of way, and I can transfer that learning to other texts in the future. So I always want to emphasize the reflection and the metacognitive questions that come up in our work. That's Reading Like a Detective. It's great. There's a lot going on in it. So just to kind of recap that journey, we start by looking at the landlady and thinking about what does it mean to read like a detective. We practice that with a set of advertisements that you'll select and bring in for the class to work with. Then students read through 2 nonfiction texts that have a lot of subtext and sort of social commentary going on in them. They read through Kozol and Schlosser. They write a paper about each. They choose one paper to revise and reflect on their learning.